Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Great Manners Radio. I'm your host, Michael Devine, America's counselor. And this, I don't know what the hell's going on across from me. He was the armchair quarterback. Now he just looks like a cross between it's like Bane's younger lab tech brother. I don't know, man. It just kind of worries me a little bit.
Well, of course.
You know, I thought I was like smart with having the coronavirus sniffing dog. But the thing is, though, she does a weird thing. Every time she smells it, she just rolls on her belly and wants a belly rub, but then she always does it. So I don't really know if there's coronavirus or she just wants a belly rub. So it wasn't really
coronavirus. I'm wearing this because your entire family's been infected with the flu. You being around it, I'm worried about you, coronavirus.
That was multiple days ago. I mean, our experts tonight will probably be able to help us understand this. So, but everybody, I'm Michael Devine, and so one of the things on this show, I know I'm always getting yelled at by either Republicans or Democrats, usually both of you guys, because apparently when you're in the middle, everyone hates you. So, which is awesome, yay me. So I know we're always talking about politics, and a lot of times Trump takes all the oxygen out of the room. But the reality is, I mean, the show really a lot of times the topics we cover is about it's covering the things that that our politicians should be covering, and you can't. I always have this little what the fuck moment in the beginning of the show. And one of the biggest what the fuck moments I read an article the other day of how if the United States were to have a massive pandemic, that we don't have the resources for it. I mean, the financing isn't there. The drilling isn't there. And the thing is, it's like we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on walls to protect us from imaginary enemies that might happen. We spend trillions of dollars on military technology in the case that maybe something happens. But the thing is, well, we spend, I'm not going to pull a number out my ass, we'll just say 50% of our GDP on preparing for shit that might happen. And then because then, our politicians like give sweetheart deals, fat contracts, kickbacks to all their friends, right? There ain't no money left over for the shit that actually might fuck with us, that actually might annihilate.
What, you mean like a plague?
Like a plague, like a virus, right?
Like what, you mean this won't save me?
I don't know. Our guest tonight is hopefully going to be able to set us straight. So in case you've been hiding underneath a rock, there is a pandemic. It's called a coronavirus. Now, they haven't made a name for it yet. It's the same family as MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, I believe. And then there was SARS, which was it South Asian, I think, respiratory syndrome. And it's in the same family as those. And it's new. It's novel. Ain't no cure for it, and it's kind of scary. So everyone's kind of talking about it, and so that's when I was like, you know what? Let's talk about it. And then, of course, we are lucky enough to have a good friend of the show, Dan Evans. Dan is a graduate student at University of Pittsburgh in their infectious disease lab, and we are lucky enough to have him come on the air to basically help us know if are we fucked? Should I be wearing a mask right now? Should I train my dog better to sniff out coronavirus? So, Dan, the man Evans, how you doing, my brother?
Oh, man, it's good to be back. I missed you guys. It's been way too long,
man.
Really excited to talk about science and just talk about fun shit and check out the respirator mask on my other co-host that were here.
Well, everyone laughs until, it's not paranoia unless you need it. I guess we're safe here. I guess. Okay.
Well, but my whole thing was like, so I'm not going to lie. So when I knew Dan was going to be on the show, and so my wife, I was asking everyone, hey, what kind of questions we should ask? And Dan and I had a good banner going out through the weekend. And internally, I was going, all right, so if this guy is doing the interview from a secure location wearing like one of those like giant like suits, that's when I'm like, all right, we're fucked.
I ordered mine. Mine hasn't arrived yet. I'll be there here for next week's show if we're still alive.
Although I'm not convinced, Dan, because I remember in the movie The Stand, I remember they were saying how the president, they were trying to fake that it wasn't that bad. So they made a replica of the Oval Office, but it was clearly underground. And I'm just like, so at first I felt fine, but then the paranoid part of my brain is going, does that just look like, a normal living room, or is he really? So I don't know.
Well, Dan, you're half right, because my living room is in the basement of my building. So you are half right about the underground part, right? So
so Dan, I know I introduced you a little bit, but just for the people at home, just so they know we're not full of shit here. We're not just pulling this stuff out of our ass. Just give everyone just a brief little intro into who you are, what you're doing, and more importantly, why you are a worthwhile subject to talk about this topic.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the introduction. So, as you said, I am a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public Health, and the focus is on infectious diseases and microbiology. And I also work full time as a microbiology lab tech in the School of Medicine's Division of Infectious Diseases. So, in my full time work, I'm in touch with a lot of physicians who are world class, mostly focusing on like antibiotic resistant bacteria, but we also do some genomic epidemiology. So we're taking like the classic epidemiology everyone thinks of with infectious diseases and adding like 21st century technology for to make predictions and tracking these diseases better. And so my specialty, my focus is in bacteria, but a lot of the coursework that I take is in virology. A lot of the people that I work with are virologists as well. And so there's been a lot of discussion among the experts that I get the privilege to work with. And so I'm here to try and impart some of that knowledge. And I want a disclaimer, like I'm not the world's most experienced infectious disease guy.
You know more than we do, my man.
I want to try and get the word out, try to make sure that people are getting their facts straight. So whatever little I can do, I'm just really happy to be on the show.
Yeah, and that's like, I think, it's kind of like funny. It's like with psychology, people are like, well, you're psychology, I'm like, well, I mean, like I know family systems and developmental psychology, and I'm pretty good with neuropsych, but get me on anything else, I can learn it, I understand it, I can read up some things, and I'm gonna be able to explain it. But by no means am I an expert on everything. But not everybody has an infectious disease, researcher, grad student in their back pocket they can pull from. So the way I look at it, you're gonna tell us more than what we'd be able to find, let's say, on Reddit or something. So. Yeah, I
don't know. There's some really good doctors on Reddit these days, right? Well, but I'll try my best to answer some questions for you guys.
So let's dive in here, because I think this is like always to me like my worst fucking nightmare. Okay, and maybe it's because I'm Jewish and a little bit of OCD and germ phobia just maybe is ingrained in my DNA. But it's the idea that we have something like Ebola was scary enough, right? Because I was in Dallas when Ebola hit, and my wife was a nurse, and that was scary when it had to be like body fluid, right? But in all the movies, like Contagion, The Stand, it's like this flu that you just so much as sneeze, people get it, people die, it's easily transmitted, and it's just a scary thing that something like, I mean, what was it, in 1918, the Spanish flu killed what was it, 20%, 30% fatality rate or something like that? Or
more people died from the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919 than people died in the First World War.
Yeah.
And that's so infectious diseases are a huge problem around the world.
Bubonic plague, that killed what almost half the planet at the time or something like that. And
half of Europe's population.
Yeah. Like
thanks to the fleas.
I know. And so like when you see like in our history, we have a right to be scared of it, right? And we've dodged a lot of bullets. The Ebola one was like, all right, body fluid, but hey, we got it under control. We've been seeing constant outbreaks in Africa. But then the SARS one, I almost forgot about, but I remember they're saying like how contagious it was. It was what was that? I'm trying to think what the percentage, because normal flu is what, like 2% or something like that. I remember I had the numbers out there. It was like
for like fatality rates you're talking about?
Yeah, it was like what normal flu is what 0.01%. It's like normal flu. Then like when you start getting up there, it's what like 10%, 20% for like SARS, Spanish flu, kind of ballpark somewhere in that range. And so that's just crazy to me, because like I think we always looked at Ebola as being one of those like, oh, it killed like 90% of people, but the contagion rate, the ability to transmit it from one person to the next was low. So this coronavirus is scary. So help us. All right. So I guess the first question I have for you here, and this is the one I think a lot of people are asking, is how is it a virus can show up out of nowhere? Something new, something novel. And why is that so dangerous to humans when it's something new and novel?
Well, that's a really good question to start out with, because everyone hears about the term patient zero and like, well, what does that actually mean? So I think a good way to think about this is that viruses don't come out of just nowhere. They don't just materialize from somewhere. Viruses and bacteria and fungi and other like microbes that can cause disease are always circulating around us, always circulating in our environment, and they have different natural hosts. So we were talking about influenza for a while. The major reservoir species of influenza are waterfowl, so ducks and geese and birds like that, right? So a lot of influenza viruses stay in there. Ebola or HIV or derivatives of HIV were circulating in apes and monkeys in sub-Saharan Africa for a very long time. And so what happens when a virus kind of emerges, as we say, out of nowhere, at least with regard to the human population, is what's called a spillover event. And so shameless plug, one of the best books I've ever read, a guy named David Quammen, he's a world-renowned writer. He wrote a book called Spillover, where he talks about these major pathogens. So if you guys want some good reading, that's a really great book. It's digestible, but it's really informative as well. And so what a spillover, so a spillover event is when an infectious disease, let's say a virus, mutates in such a way that it can move from one host species to another. So for HIV, the big spillover event was when the ape version of the virus had a mutation that allowed it to infect humans, and then of course it made contact with humans and was able to start transmitting. So the coronaviruses, there's been a whole lot of research in the last couple of weeks and last couple of months for this outbreak to try and figure out what the original reservoir species was that yielded the spillover event, because if you can understand where it came from, then you can potentially stop the source of this outbreak from happening. So that's how these come out of nowhere. It's not out of nowhere, it's from one species into another.
And so the thing is like, I know one of the things we've been hearing a lot about is that I think they said, well, there's two ways. So there's a conspiracy theory, and then what it sounds like the WHO and the Chinese government is saying is that the legitimate surface reason is that, okay, hey, they have like these illegal markets where they eat like bat, snake, and so I guess they, yeah, I mean it's crazy. It's a delicacy, but it's illegal though. It's illegal though. And so apparently they're saying that they think maybe the crossover event happened in one of those markets where somebody came in contact with a bat and then it just crossed over into the humans and it went from there. I heard that's the one. The second one I heard, though, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this one. So apparently in 2017, the WHO and the U.S. government was basically trying to get China. There is a infectious disease, a SARS. It's a SARS and a MERS a research facility that is in Wuhan, and that the theory was that because they said basically they were worried that it might get out and that they didn't like their security protocols. And then so ironically, it's in the same exact city as the same place that they talked about it maybe being like not sufficient enough. So what are your thoughts as to like, do you think the legitimate story of the illegal market holds water? Do you think there might be something where maybe they're hiding a screw up?
So it's actually really interesting because I think I disagree personally with both of those hypotheses.
Oh,
and so
okay.
One of the reason why is, so in advance of you gave me a couple days warning about the show, I've been monitoring some of the latest news from the scientific side to try and learn as much as I can, because again, I'm not a coronavirus expert, but I want to see what's out there. And so some of the latest research that's been coming out, and I want to get to a point about like the value of how research has changed to deal with this outbreak. Some of the latest research has suggested that like the patient zero acquired the virus using like studying rates of mutations in the virus. It happened considerably longer ago, several months before the kind of the market that's been the real focus actually emerged. So it's possible that it did spread very rapidly by being introduced into a market and spreading. But where did it come from? It's possible it just came from some kid or some person who was playing with a bat or playing with a snake or something like that. So it's really hard to nail that down. But these markets that you're talking about, if the virus was able to get in, that's, think about really dense population. If it was like a bat coronavirus and they are eating bats there, that's an ideal breeding ground for a virus that's undergoing a spillover event. So I don't want to say that's the source of it, but it's a place where if it did make it into there, it could have been dramatically amplified. So that's the first point.
And so really, the research, what you're saying is almost going, this may have been the crossover that could have been a couple months ago. It's just been slowly mutating until it got into the slow build of what it is now.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, will they find that out? I mean, will it take a long time to figure out the DNA testing of it? Like, how do they even figure that one out?
They never figured out like how technically where HIV and AIDS started in humans, right?
They never still figured it out how the crossover event happened, right?
Well, I mean, there's theories like he said, but like I don't know if there's any definitive proof.
Yeah,
I don't know if they're gonna find that out. Maybe they will, but I don't know.
So there's the other thing about infectious diseases is that there's no really typical case of a spillover event. They all happen all the time. Think of all the complexity behind it. There's a lot of gray area, which is why I'm glad to be on the show.
Gray matters. That's how we deal with it.
It's a perfect show to talk about this. But
so it's not like in the movies where you're going to see it like escape from the lab very dramatically, and like you know what I mean. Someone gets bit by like a rabid goat. And like no.
That's a funny way to think about it. But you think about the Ebola outbreak, they were actually able to trace it back to a very specific event where a kid went into a hollowed out tree and was playing with bats and and they thought that was a spillover event because like there was no cases genomically that predated that. So with some viruses, with some outbreaks, you can really trace back with a lot of accuracy. And so I said a couple minutes ago that science has evolved to be able to manage this outbreak much better. And that's kind of one part of it. So the last major coronavirus outbreak that kind of shocked the world was a SARS outbreak, so severe acute respiratory syndrome. And it happened in East Asia, spilled over into Canada. A couple cases came to the United States, really scary. All of a sudden it dried up. Since then, it's been about 16, 17 years since that really emerged. And in that time, genome sequencing, which is really essential for these kinds of outbreak investigations, has become a lot faster, a lot cheaper, and a lot more widely available. International communication among scientists and epidemiologists has gotten a lot better. And so, an emerging thing that has happened in science is so the kind of the currency of science, the way that you prove your worth to other scientists and to the public is by publishing these called peer-reviewed manuscripts, where you're reporting these articles. You have people who are already scientists review these, and then when they think, okay, this is good, you've done all your research properly, you've done your proper controls and everything, we'll publish this paper. One thing that's emerged recently for this outbreak has been the preprint, and so scientists have been reporting findings without going through this peer review process, which sometimes you might think like, oh, there might be some tweaks that need to happen, but there's been a lot of valuable information that's been introduced to the scientific community much faster than if we were just waiting for the peer review process. So you talk about the R0 value that kind of went viral a few days ago, no pun intended. That came out of a preprint. Some of the early investigations about was it a bat versus a snake versus some other animal, a lot of that was like genomic epidemiology studies that were being published in preprints. And so the international community is able to get a lot more information a lot more quickly because science itself has evolved in the last 15 years. Speaking of genomic epidemiology, so as of the second question about, was there a spillover outbreak from like the Wuhan virus, that would be a possible theory using the technology from 15, 20 years ago. But now there have been a lot of preprints that have come out that have shown that like the sequence of these viruses has been sequenced and has been compared to other known coronaviruses, and they've been able to trace them back to, it's very likely that there was a bat, or potentially there was one preprint that suggested maybe there was a snake spillover. So nobody has been able to say, hey, this is the actual coronavirus from this lab, because if that coronavirus was sequenced and picked up, we would have known about it by now if it was like the laboratory strain, because sequencing has become faster, quicker, and more importantly, faster to report because of the rise of preprints. So does that kind of answer? That's like a couple questions answered at once.
No. And what was really cool, and doing my research, I guess I didn't know this, Bill. I don't know if you knew this. Like, so researchers, I guess, to help predict what the next outbreak might be, so I guess like anywhere right now, birds, right? Snakes, bats, whatever, they're all carrying viruses. And so I guess scientists will go into the wild and follow their migration patterns and swab like countless numbers of ducks, geese, bats, birds, whatever, and see what viruses they have, so they can try to somewhat predict where something might come or what the next one might be. It's fascinating. I really had no idea that's where they were really kind of going kind of into it, which is really, really fascinating.
The reason why they do that is because we're realizing that spillover events are so common. And so because sequencing technology has gotten cheaper, faster, easier to do, and because we're realizing more and more about this, there's a lot more preemptive, preventative work to try and set up these monitoring systems and be prepared for these outbreaks by having these repositories of data that we just didn't have to deal with previously large outbreaks in the early 21st century and before.
And so now here's, so explain that you mentioned, I know we kind of mentioned the word R0. So, because this is the thing that we're hearing a lot about how contagious this particular virus is, right? So explain maybe to the listeners, what technically an R0 is, how they even figure it out, and what is, because I know we're hearing lots of sensationalist kind of claims, some coming from China. some things seems at odds with what officials are saying. So I guess maybe the third part of that is, what is it that you guys are hearing with legitimately how contagious this virus is, and how is it being spread from person to person?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but it's important. This is like the crux of what's happening, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
just to answer the direct question about R naught. So R naught, or R sub zero, is a coefficient that is, or just a mathematical value that is computed using kind of a mix of some of the genomic epidemiology that I talked about, as well as what we call kind of the shoe leather epidemiology, where you find like these cases that are reported and try to trace back who the common sources were. Like, you do all that work, and then scientists using that can come up with values that roughly approximate how many people will this virus spread to from a single person. So an R naught value is roughly a proxy for if one person under perfect circumstances, how many is infected, how many other people are going to infect that. So for measles, which is one of the most infectious diseases that we know, the R naught in certain cases can be as high as 14 or 15. So one infectious person can infect 14 or 15 people. Most flu viruses are between 1 and 2, depending on their Ebola can be a little bit higher. But for the SARS one, the one that has really started the one value that people have really hung on to is that they estimated that the R naught for this coronavirus is about 3.8. So about between 3 and 4 people would get infected from an infectious patient. Now, the reason why that's so important is because the R naught value is kind of a theoretical frictionless vacuum estimate. When you talk about implementing infection control procedures, like you talk about respiratory masks and quarantining patients and doing proper screening, the actual effective rate of transmission is going to drop substantially. Okay. And so an R naught value of 3.8 is not good. You want it to be lower, obviously. Like, if you have a below 1, then that disease is going to eventually spread back to 0, but it's not insurmountable. And because we know so much so early in terms of, or at least have so many ideas about what this virus is doing so early, we can start implementing things to control it.
Now, one of the stories I heard, and this was like wild to me, that, and I think this came from one of the doctors who died, I think, from it, one of the early responders. And I guess it was based on, I think, anecdotal evidence. I don't think it was really based on any hard things they saw in the lab, but he goes, he thinks it's more contagious than what anyone's letting on, because he goes, he had full bodyguard, but he said the one thing that wasn't protected was his eyes. And he said his theory was that it was somehow also contagious through the eyes, which he said would bump up the R naught value. But once again, that's the only place where I really heard that. Is that even, like, I guess, possible? How is that? And then are you guys hearing anything similar to that, or?
It's absolutely possible. And so, I mean, to quickly
scary.
answer the follow-up question
your fucking
first,
eyes, like, damn. Fuck, don't blink. Possible, I mean, shit.
It is possible, but that's also kind of leads into so much. There's, like I said, there's a lot that we've learned by doing like the epidemiology and the outbreak investigation, but there's still a lot that we don't know about, like how this virus actually works. And so that can lead into mechanisms of transmission, whether or not the transmission can be asymptomatic. I can get into that for a second. There's so much we don't know. So
that was the other one I wanted you to ask, because they're saying that you can have no symptoms and you're contagious for like up to 10 to 14 days. So like, I was gonna have you mention that, so I'll put that bug in your ear.
Yeah, I'll talk about the asymptomatic thing in a second, but yeah, most viruses and most like especially respiratory infections, so you talk about flu, cold, whatever, the way that they transmit is by you have viral particles that are released by, they infect your cells, and then they just your cells basically become little factories for more viruses. And then when viruses are shed off of your infected cells, they then get transmitted in small droplets that, from coughing or sneezing. And then if you like cough or sneeze onto a doorknob and somebody else touches their doorknob and then touches their face, then all of a sudden those droplets with live viruses in them have made contact with your mucous membrane. So you could possibly rub your eye and get infected. When Zika was hit really hard, there were documented cases of people who had Zika infections in their eyes, as well as when the rest of their body had cleared their infection, the Zika was still hanging out in their eyes, kind of asymptomatic.
Why the eye?
So
Okay, it's like the cytoplasm. Is it like, why is it just float around in there still?
So it's possible. So the eye, so if you think about the structure of the eye, if you really delve into it, there's a lot of really sensitive nerves, and it's really close to the brain. And so it's what scientists call an immunoprivileged site. So throughout most of your body, you have a lot of immune cells, like white blood cells. You might hear about B cells and T cells and antibodies and all this stuff. You have an immune system that's constantly patrolling your body on the lookout for infectious diseases. There are some parts of your body, namely your central nervous system, like your brain and your spine and your eyes, where you don't have as high of a load or the same kind of payload of immune cells. And that's because you risk, if you have like an autoimmune reaction to your brain, then, well, you're kind of fucked, right? Or your central nervous system, you could go paralyzed, your eye, you could go blind. And so we have evolved immunoprivileged sites. That said, the eye, it's a possibility, but it's much, much more likely for this coronavirus that it's just a standard, like through mucous membranes, like respiratory, through your nose and mouth, and just by touching your face. The other thing is, we're talking about like respiratory masks and all the protective gear and everything. It only works if you use it 100% properly. If there's a lot of people who will like wear a mask and then unconsciously just kind of go under their mask and touch their face or something like that because it gets itchy or something, or you want to adjust it or something. Well, if you have coronavirus on your fingers,
a minutes got real itchy. I was like, oh, don't do it, because someone's gonna say you can't do that.
Yeah, and what if you have a big beautiful beard like you do, and you guys can scratch that itch, right? So there's so many ways. So you have these ideas. It all comes down to like what works in theory and what works in practice. You can have the world's best respirator that no virus is going to come through it, but if it only works if you don't put your fingers under it or you keep it on all the time.
And that's what happened in Dallas with Ebola, that they weren't properly trained on how to take off all their garb, and that's when they got infected. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that kind of leads into asymptomatic carriage as well. Like the thing about some of these other severe infectious diseases is we kind of been fortunate that most of the transmission happens symptomatically. So when you are, for Ebola, when you're coughing and sneezing and have all these body fluids coming out of you, side note, Ebola does not make you like bleed out like all the people are afraid. There's different symptoms. But if you have like respiratory droplets or body fluids that you then make contact with when you're sick, that's most likely the virus is shedding really well there. And so that's more likely when you're going to get infected. The big question about coronaviruses for here is whether or not you said there's asymptomatic transmission. And basically what that is there's a lot of like respiratory viruses, mainly cold and flu, that by the time that you feel that you're a little bit sick, you've already, chances are, passed on enough virus because the virus has already replicated and been able to be transmitted.
Yeah.
So if that is happening, that's a bigger worry for people who are trying to control this, because you can't just slap a mask on everyone who's coughing and hopefully the disease will just die down. It's much more complicated. That's the big question.
Plus you're in flu season. So what's it delineate? Because what they say with this one, it's like for the first 7 days, it almost mirrors and like mimics a normal flu A, flu B, but it's at that weak point where it's like you're not getting better, then all of a sudden it starts going really downhill. And man, that's just...
So what are you going to do? You're going to tell every person who has a slight fever and a cough and a sneeze that they have coronavirus? Like, that creates a lot of panic, and that's why there's so much complexity here, because you can't really confirm until you have a diagnostic lab test, which can take a while. And a lot of these rapid tests that are needed, a lot of scientists try to swear by them, but some of them are pretty inaccurate. I don't know honestly too much about the coronavirus testing, but it is possible that you might get false positives or false negatives. So like you can try as much as you can to control the outbreak, but you're not going to catch every single case. And if it is asymptomatic carriage, not catching every single case is going to be a much bigger problem. So that's the big question that people still haven't come out. People are leaning to think that it's likely not asymptomatic carriage, but it's still possible. Gotcha. Again, this is really rapidly evolving because this has only been a couple of months and the whole world is focused on this. So every hour there's more stuff coming out. Like 5 minutes before we went on, I saw that the BBC reported the official death toll had risen above 100 people, right? Like every 5 minutes there's something new.
And China's trying to suppress all the information that's coming out of there. And of course you can't trust them because they're going to say, nope, all is well.
Well, they did that with SARS even, and they got nailed for it.
China,
and
what do you expect? This is a country that manipulates its own currency so you think they're going to be honest about something that's going to, just to save face? They're just, no, everything's fine. They're going to very downplay it, at the very least, to keep calm in the country. But did you guys hear about that YouTube video that leaked out from China?
I was actually going to ask you, did you see that, Dan? The YouTube from the nurse? So pretty much and one, Bill, you're talking about. So basically there was a nurse that was basically at the Wuhan, their main hospital that was there. And so she pretty much, it was like on a WhatsApp subreddit kind of little thing. And then it got boosted out to everyone. It
And she
went
was wearing a
viral.
mask too, so she couldn't be identified on top of it.
Exactly, yeah. And so what she was saying was that don't believe anything that the Chinese government is saying, is that we really have upwards of over 100,000 cases. She goes, it's much deadlier, it's rapidly mutating and becoming more deadly and more contagious, and that, they're in full-blown like panic mode and they're suppressing the truth, right? Now, that being said, it's tough to take everything that you see on the internet. So I think that's what's scaring a lot of people, is that everyone's always waiting. It's human nature to wait for the big one, right? And so whether it be the apocalypse, whether it be biblical end times, whether it be a virus, this is one of those ones where it gets everyone's attention. Like, is this it, right? So from what you guys are seeing, like, because I know scientists, like it being, in academia, there's always back channels. It doesn't matter if you are your only enemies, politically speaking. Science is science, and scientists will talk to each other. Have you gotten any information from just colleagues, professors, people talking to people actually in China saying, no, this is actually what's really going on there? Or are you guys in the dark like all of us?
So for me personally, I'm not high up enough in the whole like CDC academic hierarchy to be privy to a lot of these conversations personally. But what I do know is that there is a lot of international pressure that's hitting China right now because SARS was kind of blew out of control because they were trying to suppress information, right? So, and the what's interesting is that these preprints I was talking about before, a lot of them that are like documenting these are coming from Chinese research groups. So they're not coming from CDC people who are kind of smuggling their way in and trying to do information. They're coming from researchers in China who are publishing their work online. And it's when you publish something on, it's like one of the biggest preprint sites is called bioRxiv. If you publish something on there, it's going to be kind of hard for that to be taken down because, what the Chinese government or any government really realistically cannot take that whole website down without completely crippling its scientific industry. So there is information coming out there. So for me, I really don't know what to think. All I can do is just see what data are being put out and then also kind of shift the conversation. We can have a whole detailed conversation about what China might or may not be doing, but we can shift the conversation and be more focused on what we in the United States are doing to make sure that when we do get these cases, we are prepared. And I think in terms of like panic for American citizens, which is, I'm assuming is the grand majority of our listening people right now, is that the United States and the network of physicians and doctors and microbiology researchers here are really well prepared to make sure that this is not going to become a problem over here. Just a couple of days ago, the head of the Division of Infectious Diseases where I work sent out a very detailed, laid out plan for the infectious disease personnel in the city. Is like, hey, this is what we would do if we did get a coronavirus case. Major hospital centers across the country are doing the same thing. People are preparing on our end, which is why we're getting so few cases here. And the CDC does a really good job of tracking people down. I know people love to throw conspiracy theories around with the CDC, but on our end, regardless of what's happening in China, we are making sure with a lot of confidence that we can handle whatever gets thrown at us overseas.
Do you and this is where I think I talked at the beginning of the show of how the ironic thing is like the dumb shit will waste money on. That is like maybe this will happen. And then it's like, no, this is like real shit that can happen. When that article came out saying that the U.S. is basically completely unprepared for a major pandemic now, that was just a newspaper. And once again, I know there's a whole hierarchy, CDC, but do you share that thought? Do you think we are woefully unprepared? Do you think that we're a lot better prepared than what people think?
I vehemently disagree with that.
Yeah.
So I think and this is not just me. People can say, "Oh, he's in the science and he's in whatever."
You're part of the problem.
You're part of the system. Yeah, go fuck yourself, guys. No. So what's happening? Realistically is, so I mentioned before, like there's major hospital systems around the country are coming up with these plans, making sure these are in place. There's so much communication between public health and medical agencies around the country, locally, statewide, federally, that happens behind the scenes that people don't even know about because it's not in the news. If it was in the news, that would be bad. But not just for coronaviruses, but I work with hospital-acquired infections. There's all kinds of discussions between the CDC, like the federal, the state, local levels, and everything about these infectious diseases. We have some of the best research universities in the world, some of the best medical research in the world. And so when we think about, the United States is woefully unprepared for a pandemic, if a pandemic did really surge out of nowhere, that would be a serious problem. Would our country fall as a result? I'm really, really doubtful of that, because we have invested so much time and money and effort and resources over the past 70, 80 years into the development of the CDC, into the development of state and local health departments who are capable of preparing for potential pandemics. So I do disagree with that. I'm not going to say that if a pandemic level virus did emerge out of the United States, that it would not be damaging, that it would not be problematic. I'm sure it would be. But I don't think we would fall as a society unless there's something really, 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 really unusual that would happen, because we have put so much into protecting our public health.
And that is the $1,000,000 question I wanted to ask. And I know this is like probably purely theoretical, but I know in psychology we have theories like of different things, may not hold water, right? But so what is, like, when you look at a pandemic, I'm talking like, I don't know what, if there's a classification level of pandemics, but like, what would it really look like in modern society? Because I know like the closest corollary we have is 1918, and what made that one so bad,
Spanish flu.
Yeah, from my understanding was that it was in Europe, and all the soldiers coming home from World War I, and everyone that's what really made it go. And that a lot of people say, well, technically it could be worse now because how much more mobile we are, how quick, how much the population density, but so I mean, what is it that we would be seeing? Like, if you're like Mike, if you really want to know it's time to like really start panicking or kind of get your attention, what would we see according to theory that would then go, this might get out of control?
So that's another complicated question, right?
Yeah.
No, it's the $1,000,000 question, as you said. So one thing that is worth reflecting on is when you talk about these pandemic potential diseases, is like with the 1918 flu pandemic. Yes, soldiers coming home and all this stuff. There was so much less that we knew, and so much less public health infrastructure that we had back then than we do now. So you talk about, like vaccination strategies. Yeah, there's no coronavirus vaccine, but the rate at which things can be applied, and if it really did turn into a true pandemic, which, side note, means like independent spread in multiple places across the world. The coronavirus outbreak right now is not considered a pandemic by the World Health Organization, because the widespread transmission is only in China. We have isolated cases from around the world as international travel, but those cases are not spreading into thousands of more cases. Yeah. That's the definition of a pandemic.
Gotcha.
So it's not currently a pandemic. That's an important point. But today, with really available rapid diagnostics, sequencing technologies that we have, and the rapid international global communication that we have among scientists and politicians and these people who need to make these decisions in charge, that infrastructure has evolved beyond our wildest dreams from 1918 to 2020. So if not 2020, but I just stammered there, my bad. But you're worried about like when we have more international travel and everything. I believe that for most cases, there's more than offset. And the coronavirus outbreak right now is a really good example of that, because you think about, okay, we had some isolated cases hit Australia, one just hit Ecuador, we had 5 or 6 that have hit the United States, some have hit, I don't know, I honestly have lost track. But think about if we did not have the international attention and the medical technology that we have now, each one of those cases that came back would have already spread. And if the virus was as contagious as we believe it is, then we would already be having a global pandemic about this. But it hasn't happened because first world countries with good medical infrastructure are monitoring the situation, making sure that proper protocols are in place. So this is a good example of this virus could go pandemic. And it's unlikely, I think it's unlikely, but it's still possible. But there's so much surveillance that's happening right now that we are in a very good position. And this is a test of our global public health infrastructure and communication. And so far, outside of China, we are passing that test. So,
well, and I imagine we'll have more data now that we have on our own soil people that are sick. I imagine we'll start getting some more information about how do we treat it, because from what I've understood, there really isn't much to treat it. The rumors that it is mutating from person to person. Like, so hopefully we'll get that data, but I imagine it might be a month or two even before they really fully understand this thing. You think?
Mm-hmm. It's hard to quantify because it depends on whether or not you're trying to develop antiviral drugs versus a vaccine. Like, there's so many different ways that you can do that. But honestly, the best thing that people can do right now to try and prevent or do their best to stop to not get sick or to prevent them from suffering from this virus is just to regularly practice good hand hygiene. Washing your hands cures so many infections, prevents so many infections. Being careful about touching your face. Just the little simple things that you can do to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to infectious diseases needlessly. So that's something that people can do right here, right now. But in terms of like development of vaccines and everything, yeah, that's going to take some time. But in the meantime, there's a lot that we can do to treat these cases. So Ebola, for example, yeah, Ebola vaccines have come out, but at the peak of the massive outbreak in West Africa that killed tens of thousands of people, the best treatment that they had was just rehydrating people because they were losing so many body fluids, right?
Yeah.
A lot of viruses don't really have an effective cure because the way that the biology of viruses works. So for bacterial infections and fungal infections, you have antibiotic and antifungal drugs. That the way that they work is based on the life cycle of those bacteria and those fungi. Viruses are a whole different ballgame. So there's not a whole lot of treatments that are really effective for a lot of viruses, but that doesn't mean that we cannot treat patients effectively who have the infection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but why is that? Because like I know your research is on more bacteria, antibiotic resistance, and I mean we've talked on previous shows how we've woefully not developed any new classes of antibiotics with antibiotic resistance, but with viruses though, I mean shit, herpes. I mean we've been studying herpes. I mean that shit's like luggage. You still can't get rid of fucking herpes, right? I mean, and so it's like, and I know bacteria is more your jam, but like, why is it viruses in particular that, I mean, look at our flu shots every year. It's a crapshoot. You even have a virus, because I know some people say, well, it mutates so much, but then you have, I believe, flu B, that it's very static. It doesn't really change, even though flu A, I think, mutates
Flu
a lot
shots,
more.
Man, the first time I got a flu shot that I can remember, I'm sure I had one when I was a kid, was right before the birth of our first son. My wife's like, you got to get a flu shot. You know, you can't be getting sick around the new baby. Went down, got a flu shot. About a month and a half later, I got as sick as I've ever been in my life. 2 straight weeks on my ass, laying in bed. I had bronchitis, the flu, whatever you want to call it, all this shit. I remember by like day 10. At day 10, I was just like, shouldn't I accidentally be feeling any better? Like, it was bizarre. I was like, oh, it's the man flu. I'm like, no, I think this is like the new Spanish flu 2.0. Like, I thought I was dying. And I told her, I said, because my wife's a nurse, and I said, man, you told me to get a flu shot, and I got the flu. The worst I've ever had it in my life. I'll never let her forget that. I still get one every year now, but I mean, you know.
So yeah, we're getting to this with a whole lot of questions, but it's real. This is all really important.
This is the shit everyone asks on a daily basis, and it's like, all right, why are viruses so hard to figure out? Like we seem like we're nowhere closer to figuring it out.
Yeah. So let's talk about antivirals and antibiotics, how they work and what makes them different. And then I definitely want to talk about vaccines and flu shots as well, because we've talked about this before in the show, and I think it's now more than ever, it's more important, right? So viruses are really difficult to treat compared to, or like to treat with like a drug to kill the virus, because the life cycle of viruses, they're what we call obligate intracellular pathogens. Would not to remove the gobbledygook from there, it's the virus needs to go into your cells and use your cells' machinery in order to reproduce itself.
It's like cancer, right? Almost, basically. And is that why some of the new treatments are talking about using de-weaponized cancer to basically go into the cells to kill the viruses? Like, is that the mechanism, basically, overly simplified?
That's a whole ball game. I'm not super qualified to talk about that, so I'm going to leave that there. But the main thing is with viruses, because in order to treat a virus, you have to have a drug. If you want to kill the virus after you've gotten it, you have to get a drug that's going to be able to go into your cells, mess with that virus without really messing too much with you. But the problem is viruses use so much of your machinery. Like a lot of viruses, again, viruses, there's no one type of virus. There's viruses are incredibly diverse. There's the most abundant and diverse nucleic acid based type of organism in the biosphere, right? So, but the main thing that viruses have is they all need a host to replicate. And so if you're going to try and kill the virus after it infects, you're running a really high risk of damaging the host in the process. So a lot of these antiviral drugs that come out, a lot of them are experimental, a lot of them fail in clinical trials because they were too toxic to the host. With bacterial infections and antifungal infections, these are bacteria and fungi. They occupy parts of your body and they grow inside your body, but they're their own independent cells in most cases. Some bacteria can like go into your own cells, and those are more complicated to treat. But in general, you don't have to. You can design drugs that are specific to killing the bacteria, or killing the fungi, which have their own mechanisms of action and their own life cycles and their own kind of code that they operate under, which is pretty different from our own. So you can mess with that and not mess with us, with human cells, much more easily being relative. for with an antibiotic or an antifungal drug than you can with an antiviral drug. So,
So
that's
basically-
why there's
so-
so much.
so-
That's why there's so much emphasis on like preventative strategies for viruses, like vaccination. Sorry, I cut you off.
So no. So just to make it overly simplified and funny. So basically, what you're saying is like a virus is kind of like a house party you threw in college that got way out of control. You're not getting the people out of the house. So that's when you start hiding like your parents' vases, like trying to limit the amount of damage that the party can do. And eventually, the party, everyone will just party themselves out, and then you clean up the next day. Is that basically that's the best thing we got?
I love that. Let's roll with this, right? And then I have a really good metaphor for vaccines that I hope you appreciate. I thought of it this morning in the shower. But let's talk about so a viral infection. Is imagine you have a bunch of real drunk assholes who are going to come in and really mess up your house,
Fucking
right?
dicks.
A viral infection, those guys get into your house and then they start wreaking havoc. You bring the cops in, you call the cops on them. Those cops are going to shut down the party. It's going to be all kinds of crazy stuff. It's going to be a mess of a house, chances are, unless something really miraculous happens. You have an amazing cop and a really cooperative drunk guy. Right? I'm fucking. You
The
brought
virus, they moved into the house. The
right?
cops don't even know who lives there and who doesn't. This is my room.
And so, but with the bacterial infection, in most cases, you just have a bunch of drunk guys out on your front porch or a bunch of drunk guys out on your lawn. So when you call the cops on them, they can clear them off without getting into your house so much. They might have to go into your house a little bit. Maybe a cop will come talk to you. Maybe a cop will want to sweep your room a couple, for whatever reason. But most of the activity is going to be outside your house. So that's kind of the easiest way. If you imagine the house being like your cells, like the cells in your body, like that's kind of the metaphor that
makes the most sense. I think literally, you don't need to get a master's degree. Don't pay all that money. Just write a book, virology, for dummies. It's like a fucking house party, man. It's like,
oh man, I'm doing a master's degree because but working full time for the university, you get 90% off tuition. So
and that must be
it's a smart way to go. Right? I could pay full whack and be done faster, but hey, man, I value my savings.
All right, so here's like a little second kind of question, and this is more kind of in the flu, like because and Bill had a good point about the flu shots, and it's weird because I think I've had almost every major flu. I mean, I had. And I was actually going to do a fun little thing at the end of the show, so I'm not going to ruin my own fucking little thing. But I was going to have us talk about the most sick we've ever been with the flu. Okay.
That one time you came down with the Pyongyang flu.
Oh, God.
Very rare,
very rare, very radioactive.
Radioactive.
But so I've had like every.
This is going off the rails, man.
So I've had like every major flu, right? And so like it's interesting how when like my daughter or my wife has had the ones that I've had. Don't get sick at all. So I understand, like, your body builds up an immunity to it and everything, right? But I think that's what's interesting. Like, a lot of these flus have been around for a while, like H3N2, H1N1, flu A, or flu B, which is like Victoria and Yama, whatever it is. So the thing is, like, but you look at the numbers, and maybe it's just population density, whatever, but it seems like more people are getting it. It seems like more people are dying from it, these same strains. Now, it could just be, sensationalism, but does it just seem that way, that flu season's getting worse and worse every year, but yet everyone keeps getting the flu shots and you think immunity? Or is it just we're more aware of it? Like, what really is the truth? What does the stats kind of say?
So let's break this down in a couple of ways. So I want to make sure I answer all that stuff, right? Yeah. So the first thing, let's talk about first is the flu season getting worse over time? And the second thing we'll talk about is the flu vaccine and the virus itself. So is the flu season getting worse? That's really difficult to quantify, right? So you talk about like monitoring rates of flu is real tough to do, because the easiest way that most people report flu is when people go to the hospital and get tested positive for flu, right? Most cases, like if you're just sitting at home feeling like death for 2 weeks, you don't feel like you're going to the hospital. Chances are public health officials are not going to be able to pick up on that and add that piece of data to their data set to monitor the flu, right? So it's hard to say that maybe people are getting more sick, maybe people aren't, maybe there's new types of flu circulating around, maybe there's not, right? There's a lot of complexity that's based on, like, if we can't get the data to quantify that, we can't give a good number. I can say that based on hospitalization rates, there are some fluctuations that happen over a couple of different years. One thing that's particularly interesting about this year's flu season is that it's kind of the peak in cases kind of accelerated a lot faster than in previous years, so earlier on in the flu season. And so maybe that might have something to contribute to like some of the narratives around flu. But it is really hard to quantify. I'm not super concerned about like the seasonal flus that circulate in terms of them being like the apocalyptic strain that everyone's worried about.
Yeah.
So talking about the strains of flu themselves, flu is not just one type of strain of virus. And you talk about H3N2, H5N1, all these things. So it's not just the H and the N numbers that define flu. The structure of the flu virus compared to other viruses allows the flu to mutate really, really quickly and go through two different processes. One which we call antigenic drift, which is just basically mutation of like surface proteins, and one is called antigenic shift, which is where entire types of proteins get substituted for one another. And so what that means in practice is if you have antigenic drift, your flu viruses are slowly mutating so that every year the seasonal flu strains that come out, your virus doesn't have your immune system doesn't have 100% protection to that virus. That happens so quickly and so often, just the way the flu works on a molecular level. That's why we need an annual flu vaccine. It's not because there's like only the types of strains and whatever. It's because those strains are constantly mutating in ways that are difficult to quantify by an H number and an N number, which are just two surface proteins on the virus. The pandemic flu strains come about when there are like reassortment events that basically we call the antigenic shift. And that's when different segments of the flu virus genomes kind of recombine in interesting and fascinating ways and make a whole new like mutant virus that we really have no recollection of. Our immune systems just are like, what the hell is this? So that's the pandemic, all the pandemic flus that have happened, not just in 1918, but there was the Hong Kong pandemic, the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. All of those happened as the results of what we call this antigenic shift. And so we have to account for those because it's so difficult, because the flu viruses are everywhere. So many different animals can get infected for them. That's really more of the danger. The seasonal flu vaccines are meant to address more of the antigenic drift problem of like the virus is just gradually mutating over time.
Gosh, that I just keep thinking like, like how it can mutate. I'm just like, great. It's going to be like the worst diarrhea that you've ever had. And then having like pneumonia, and then having like hemorrhagic fever. I'm trying to think like what would be like take one from each one. Like what would be the most like horrific? Like, honestly, if you had to take like a combination of the most horrific virus, like and combine them together, what would be the mutant like world killing combination that you think would be just nightmares?
Are you asking the NSA to beat down my door in 20 minutes? Is that what you're asking me to do?
God damn it, Mike.
So it's a hard question to answer because I know we want to make jokes and laugh about it, but like the way that different viruses make us sick is very much dependent on like the way that they work at the molecular level. And so it's very uncommon for a virus to be able to make you like have diarrhea and cause a nasty gastrointestinal infection, as well as give you a really nasty like respiratory infection in your lungs. It's just the way the virus works. It's like the best way to think about it is like the virus has a bunch of different keys on it. And so every different part of the body that can infect has different locks. So maybe the virus has the key to get into your lung cells, but it doesn't have the key to get into your intestinal tract. And some viruses have the intestinal tract key and not the respiratory tract key. Right. So it's hard to say, oh, if I can make all this, I can make this all happen in theory and just make everyone just, have all the body fluids coming out everywhere and have it be hypertransmissible and everything. But realistically, it's going to be unlikely for something like that to happen just because the way viruses work again at that molecular level. That's why it's really important for us to support basic science research in infectious disease so that we understand these basic processes so we can respond better to outbreaks like this.
So basically the bottom line is it's like, and it's like, listen, all right, like, none of these viruses are kind of good, but especially with the coronavirus that's going on in China, it's like, listen, like, it's not good, but okay, like we're getting under control. We haven't seen anything that makes people think it's going to be like some global pandemic. Scary as shit. But a lot of it's just because this thing is novel. Our bodies do not know how to handle it. It's freaking out. But then just like science can move so quickly, we've communicated quickly, shut things down. And it's like, listen, it's not cool, but it's like, listen, we're not anywhere near that pandemic level. But obviously something we're going to keep our eyes on. Now, this will be the last science question, and then I'll have two fun questions, and we'll get the hell out of here. Right?
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it.
So I guess like one thing that you read a lot on with the internet is somehow like with it maybe changing climate, maybe it's migratory patterns, maybe there's not frost or thaws or whatever. is there any connection, any real research that shows any type of connection between viruses getting worse and climate change at all? I've heard the theories of great permafrost is melting, and woolly mammoths that had some flu are going to get released, and we're all going to die. Like, what? I don't know. What? I mean, is there any connection between the two in theory?
Absolutely. So you kind of you answer one of those questions. There was a really interesting case that I think in 2015, 2016, there was an international culling of reindeer that had been exposed to a new type of bug that caused anthrax that had actually been frozen in permafrost for tens of thousands of years dormant.
Oh shit.
And so it was able to get in a reindeer. So like as climate changes, as polar ice caps melt, as climate changes, then new old pathogens that have kind of been sealed off in these parts of the world that we really haven't had access to because of the way that climate works is emerging.
The other thing,
it is a Pandora's box. So the other side of it is as climate changes, you think about, I'm in Pittsburgh and we had like 2 days of snowfall, right? I'm like, come on, man, it's the end of January.
Man,
we haven't even dropped down below zero, man. Come on, weather. But the main thing is, so especially throughout the mid-Atlantic United States, like the temperatures are gradually rising. And so as you look at the average temperature lines, they're kind of going further and further north. When that happens, it's not really bacteria and viruses themselves, but a lot of the vectors that they get on. So like deer ticks and that can cause Lyme disease, or mosquitoes that can carry Zika or West Nile or dengue. They're able to get to further and further north throughout more of the United States, and so they can carry more infectious diseases for us. So there definitely are links between climate change and exposure to disease. In terms of mutation rates and everything, I'm sure there's a little bit more complicated there. I don't have enough experience to be able to comment on that, but I do know that risk of transmission of disease is very well documented to be linked to climate change.
And this is one that's scary shit because I don't think people talk about it. I hear a lot of the forest fighters. I have a friend who's in the forestry service in Colorado, and he was going, dude, like, the direct connection between climate change and all these fires is that he goes, yes, it's true that we need to be managing our forest better, that we're not cutting enough shit down. But he goes, we have these beetles. I can't remember the term that he used. They're destroying all the trees, right? And because it's warmer, longer, not colder.
Emerald ash borer or something.
Yeah, we have those up here where I think they said we're going to lose I think they said we're going to lose about 98% of our ash trees. There's ones out. There's like these beetles where basically what's happening is that they're eating the trees, they fall down and then become kindling, right? And he goes, it's like we're just seeing beetles. We're seeing things that because it's warmer longer, we have things that were typically in the southern United States making their way up, and the animals and everything don't have any resistance, or there's no natural predators, which is what the ash borer annihilated all the trees here in Ohio. I think Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, where they came over from China. No, it's not cold enough to kill the larvae in the winter anymore. There's no natural predators. You could introduce a natural predator, then you're going to create a whole other problem. And so it is very real. And that's the one thing we're not talking about with climate change, is that we're too busy going, well, it ain't my fault. And imagine scientists like you're going, well, who gives a fuck whose fault it is or what's causing it? This is the effect. And if we don't do something about it, this is where we can get not necessarily the virus, but it's going to be more the vectors. How they get there is what's going to change.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many after effects of climate change rather than just like the temperatures getting warmer and colder. And when we talk about infectious diseases, that is one of the big risks. And so one of the best ways that we can combat, maybe not combating climate change directly, but by combating the indirect after effects of climate change, the supplemental effects, we talk about the spread of diseases, is to really invest in our public health infrastructure and to get more people to be engaged in this. So we were joking about the flu vaccine, like getting the flu, or you had the vaccine, then you got the flu afterwards. Like, what's linked to that is more engagement, more investment into developing better vaccines for the flu, and developing better antimicrobial therapies for viral infections and bacterial infections and new fungal infections. The infrastructure that we need to support the next generation of infectious diseases that are going to evolve or emerge as a result of climate change, either directly through just like the spread of these bugs further north and further south, or because of the effects of migration of different people who are being affected by climate change, moving to different places and bringing infectious diseases that were kind of native in their populations to previously unexposed populations, right? We need to invest in our public health infrastructure, especially getting vaccinated. Shameless plug. I know it's a little bit off topic. You can joke about the flu vaccine not being effective. The CDC estimates that in the 2017-2018 flu season, vaccination in the United States prevented about 6 million cases of influenza. So yeah, people get flu, other upper respiratory infections, but vaccination is really effective. And so the more that we invest in those kinds of infrastructures, not just vaccine development, but vaccine delivery and combating what we call vaccine hesitancy, like people not being super sure about it, the better equipped we're going to be able to combat the infectious disease related after effects of climate change.
God, man. Dude, so much information, man. I feel better though. I'm not gonna lie. I feel
I'm
better.
Put my mask back on. That's what I'm gonna do.
Yeah, I would. not for because you're gonna get sick, just for your breath. Well, just it's for all of us, man.
Dan, let me ask you this. Now, we see a lot of video, even when there's not like an outbreak necessarily of a pandemic or anything like that, but like in a lot of these Asian countries, China, places like that, where a large amount of the population is wearing those masks on a regular basis, to the store, on the street. Do they know something we don't know? Is that just like one of those trends where you see one person do it and you think that's going to help? I mean, does that help? I mean, I know it doesn't hurt, but I mean, I see like hordes of people. It seems to be always be
in Asia. Yeah.
I would think them of all places would be like the most safest and secure from these kind of things. In theory, I mean, I don't know. Like, when you see that, when you see something like that, I guess my question is, when you see a video of a lot of people just wearing that in their day-to-day lives, do you laugh at that, or you're like, yeah, that makes sense, or you're just like, yeah, whatever?
I think it's great. I'm really happy to see them wearing those masks, right? So you think about it from our perspective, right? So for this case of the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak, Wuhan's enormous city. I think it's bigger than any city in the United States. Imagine if there was an outbreak of infectious diseases in LA, and then the federal government decided to shut down all travel into and out of LA. Would you not be picking up a mask? Right? You would like.
Well, they always have their masks on. I mean,
you have to pen.
It was after SARS, I think. It wasn't like they started really
Yeah. So when you think about like the way that infectious diseases spread, China is is a very large country, but it has incredibly densely populated areas, especially mainly around the cities, of course. And so the more densely populated you are, the more likely infectious diseases, not just like the really nasty ones like SARS and potentially this coronavirus and, God forbid, Ebola or something really bad, those will transmit more quickly in densely urban dense populations. But just in general, also like just colds. Right? Like minor, like upper respiratory infections that cause people discomfort, right? They're more likely to transmit the more people you have together in a really dense spot. That's just a kind of a natural law of infectious diseases. And so it's fair for them and reasonable for them to want to have, to have masks on. And if they're taking the proactive measures, that's a really, really effective way for them to do their small part to try and prevent future transmission of these really nasty diseases. So I personally am really happy to see that. Do we need to do that in the United States? Mike, I know that you asked that on Twitter the other day. We're not at that point for the coronavirus. We're really well equipped, and the main thing is what the cases that we're seeing are in urban areas, yes, where you might have more risk, but they're also the places that have really dense healthcare infrastructure. With people who have already been able to spend time preparing, have a lot of contact with the international infectious disease community. And so as long as those cases get kind of confined to individual places, we keep having really good surveillance and interventional infrastructure around these diseases, we don't really have that much to worry about. But I could be eating my own words in a month, who knows? But I'm not too worried right now.
But it is interesting because, like, you look at it, so much of an illness is based on the culture. Because you look at, like, my wife and I, we went to Bali for a honeymoon. We flew through Hong Kong, and it's like it was they had an avian flu outbreak, and it was right in April where we kind of went. And what was interesting was that it was unnerving because they come through the plane during they have all these protocols because they got hit so many times, and it's like they have the little they go, one, raise your hand if you're feeling any flu-like symptoms, right? And they hand you the mask. You get off the airplane, they have these infrared stations. They're reading people as you're walking by to identify. So, like, let's say you have a fever, you don't even realize it. The infrared will peg you, and then they'll pull you aside and do. And it was unnerving.
That's fascinating.
It was really unnerving, and so it's interesting because if you look at it's almost like every region has its own. Like the Asia, it seems to hit with the coronaviruses. Africa seems to be the hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, Marburg. There's another one in there. U.S., what do we really got? We had what's intrinsic, hantavirus, plague. Like, what has
That's
really
that's
been
been
intrinsic
that's
to
been
the
a
United States?
that's actually been a really interesting discussion that's come out, and I think there's been a book about this, or I don't actually remember where I read it, but it's something that has kind of been a residual curiosity in the back of the minds of some of like the world experts in infectious diseases. Like, there's no like American super pandemic bug. Like,
Yeah.
we had like that's unique. Like, we had like the Black Death, the bubonic plague out of Western Asia, and we have the hemorrhagic fevers out of in sub-Saharan Africa, like you said. But we really haven't had too much. And I think
Unless
one of the
you count
reasons
smallpox we gave to
Hantavirus is
the
the only
Indians.
one I remember that was intrinsic to it. Mice in like what, Colorado, Rocky Mountain region, or Rocky Mountain fever.
Yeah, it's possible. Like, we're monitoring it now well, and because we've been the current culture that we have in the United States, like the public health infrastructure has grown with this relatively new country, and so when we've had some more surveillance coming on, it's been a little bit easier to control. I think, kind of to take this down a bit of a dark turn, I think some of the people who study this and think about this agree with this. One of the reasons why we don't have such an enormous like a mega pandemic strain from the North America is because the Europeans introduced smallpox to the Native Americans, wiped out most of them. So yeah, they gave us syphilis. The syphilis is pretty native to the United States. And yeah, I guess you could say that's kind of a pandemic, but we wiped out white European colonists, wiped out so many Native Americans that whatever diseases that they might have been able to transmit to us, they never really made it into the modern era. And so it's really sad to think about how, centuries later on, there's this kind of one silver lining to this legitimate genocide. But I know that's going to get taken out of context. But
smallpox
really
could have prevented us from
about.
getting large pox. There could have been a large pox. You just don't know.
But it's such a sad and messy thing to think about that, centuries later, this terrible thing might have helped us along the long run. But man, that's a really dark set of thoughts. That is
first
it's
biological
really
warfare attack.
Well, I mean, it's like, speaking of bad things or good things that come out of bad things. Like, it's like almost like, we talk about it, and this is going to get taken out of context too. But you look at, like, say, a 9/11. I mean, as a country, our defense and our security, in theory, is probably stronger than it was prior to pre-9/11. I mean, it sucks what happened, but I think kind of with the smallpox, when
you take nuanced takes like these about anything related to, like, oh, maybe there was a silver lining out of something terrible. It's a hard place to go to because people are going to take it out of context. People are going to think, oh, 9/11 was good, or I'm glad. No, that's not what we're saying.
Well, take the guy really that's in Everett, Washington. It was because of the errors with how they handled Ebola in the United States. The hospital they took him to, it is 100% sealed. It has robotic doctors. So he was not even physically being touched by anybody. It had a robot that was checking his vitals. Everything was remotely done, and that lab was purposely created for like some type of pandemic. So you're right. Like, you don't like when people die or get sick because of screw up, but the one thing that we always have in science and medicine, we always learn from a mistake, no matter how messed up it was.
I like to think it's always, but very often, I will say.
I don't know. Ask Boeing. Hopefully, Boeing will figure out their shit. I mean, I don't know about that one.
That's the thing that you talked about, like getting screened when you went to Bali, and you think it's unnerving. When I hear about that from my standpoint, I find that as a great victory of public health. Like the fact that there's the inventions of these thermal scanners and the way that these policies have been implemented, it means that people are learning and people are responding. Because if we hadn't been learning and responding as a global civilization to these emerging infectious diseases as they have hit us, we would have had another Spanish flu come through and wipe us out and bring us right to our knees as a global civilization. But because we have learned and because we have evolved the way that we practice public health and done a lot of preventative stuff like vaccination, making sure we're developing antibiotics, having better surveillance systems, and investing in all this stuff, because we have done that, we are protecting ourselves and our future in ways that 100 years ago we could never have imagined.
Thank God for other people fucking up and making it all right for us. Man, right. So I'm gonna stop myself because I literally, like, while you were talking, I had like 5 other questions. I'm like, all right, we're already an hour in, so I'm gonna bookmark it.
I'm happy to have a part 2 anytime.
Yeah, we always gotta have you guys. I always geek out when Dan's on because we always have a great time, But this was like an important one. This was like a little not haphazard, but it was just kind of like opportunity. It was like, dude, like, let's roll with this, right? So now, all right, we're gonna end off with like a funny way of looking at viruses, if there is any way. So I want you guys to think for a second about like all the times you guys have been sick, right? And now the thing is, it is it is not like when you're sick. I'm talking like fucking flu, I mean, you're at your worst, your lowest moment. So I want to hear like the funniest, most messed up, lowest, like embarrassing story that you've had while being the sickest that you've ever been. I got like 2 or 3, but I got mine, and I'll say mine first. I will give you guys a few seconds. Plus, I'll lay the groundwork for how fucked up mine are. So my personal favorite, I maybe even already shared it on the show. So I went on a cruise. Okay, this was during the H3N2 H1N1 outbreak in 2011 or something like that. On a cruise, apparently the entire boat got it, and it was just like they kept loading and unloading people off, not probably fixing anything. So I got fucking swine flu, right? On a fucking cruise, right? I was about 3 days in. First 3 days, amazing, right? Now, the thing is, like, I started having a panic attack because we were in a rainforest and we were one of the first people to go to these ruins that literally is in this rainforest. They go, we just found this thing. We were doing something. We found it, right? So literally, I remember my back started hurting. And then I remember I was drinking a margarita, and we drank heavily for like first 3 days, right? And at first I was thinking, wow, this margarita must be really cold or must be a long day because I started shivering. Then I started like freaking out because I couldn't stop shivering. Like I'm talking uncontrollably. And then I remember my dad, like I started breaking out in sweats. And I remember my dad telling me when he had
Meat sweats.
I remember my dad telling me when he had malaria when he came back from Nam, like broken flop sweats and whatever. I got so now I'm thinking, great, I got some hemorrhagic fever from a fucking, I started having a little panic attack. And then of course I left. I'm like, I got to go to the room. I thought I was going to throw up. And then I took a hot shower because I couldn't stop shivering, which made my fever go even worse, right? So long story short, I had Jill estimated probably like 103, 104 degree fever. The next day we went to Mexico because you can go to the pharmacy there without getting a prescription. I'm like, all right, I don't know what it is, but I got the most powerful antibiotic I can get. I got like Augmentin or Bioxin, one of the two. And then Mexican cough syrup, which is a combination of codeine and like Robitussin.
And tequila.
And
this
so apparently,
story is not ending well.
dude,
I can already tell.
I was so sick. So like my chest was burning. My fever was so bad. I was even having like some really bad thinking of like, I think the air's contaminated. So then I took a giant swig because there was no cap to the cough syrup.
No.
So then I took a swig, fell asleep. Now I wake up, my chest is all fucked up. I'm out of it, right? I'm thinking, oh, it must be like 4 hours later. Do another swig. So rinse and repeat, right? So all I know is that I wake up to Jill going, oh my God, how much of this have you drank? I'm like, I don't know, like every 4 hours. She goes, it's literally been an hour and a half. So imagine having swine flu, 104 degree fever, and robo-tripping at the same exact time.
Yeah. Man.
So, yeah. So long story short, I was hallucinating. And I literally had a paranoid delusion for about 8 hours that the air is contaminated, and I sat on the deck of the boat for like half a day. I refused to go downstairs.
Well, had you passed away, they could have just thrown you overboard.
Yep. So I was going to go into like another flu with like having to switch pants multiple times, but I figured the Robitussin, robo-tripping, borderline, febrile seizure. That was more, entertaining. So, all right, that's me, Bill. What is this? Your moment of zen, worst you've ever been? Embarrassing.
Well, nothing nearly like
no
that.
robo tripping and fevers.
Yeah,
no.
I mean, like what the sickest I ever got was the story I told earlier, and that was like 2 straight weeks. It just, but nothing really bad or embarrassing happened there, other than I just couldn't understand why I couldn't get over the illness. But probably the most embarrassing thing was, I think it was like freshman year in high school. And I woke up in the morning not feeling good, and I remember, my mom's like, "No, you're going to school."
Yeah. Oh, you're going.
I'm like, "No, I'm really sick. I'm
really sick this time.
I'm really sick." Yeah, no, you're going to school. So I go to school, like I think first period, sitting there, not feeling good. Stomach's just, I don't know, it's not happening, and all of a sudden just, all over the floor right there in the middle of the English class. Everyone there sees it. Just teacher, she's the nicest lady. Was the nicest lady, and she had a Fro, who was in my class. Ironically enough, her buddy Fro. She goes, called Dave, walk Bill down to the nurse's office to make sure he gets there, right? I don't know why, but sure, make sure.
Yeah,
so Fro's walking me down.
In case you need backup.
Right, I'm not feeling good. I just yacked all over first period English, and we're walking down there. We walk by like the I don't know, like the cafeteria where they're starting to prep for the, lunch, and the smell of and
Oh.
Phil's like, it smells like hamburger day. I was like,
Oh,
oh.
God.
Of course, he's trying to make me barf again. That's the most embarrassing thing I can think of. And
That's
back, and I just
That's
puked
like
all
one of
over.
those as a therapist where it's like right before like your high school reunion and like clients going like, well, that was so long ago. No one is going to remember that. And like the first thing you walk into your high school reunion, remember that time that you fucking threw up in fifth grade?
Well, I didn't get any on myself, and I didn't really get any on anyone else. But it was just one of those things where like I couldn't even like warn anybody. It was just I was like laying there.
it just happened.
At least you didn't throw up on somebody else. That would have been
Well, one guy next to you almost got it.
I threw up in front of the hamster cage in second grade in front of the class.
That's
were you just that repulsed by hamsters,
hamster pellets, weren't you?
That's what got me. So, all right, Dan the man. All right, your moment of
zen,
zen, man.
I might sound like a goody two shoes infectious disease epidemiologist here, but I think my most shameful thing is not nearly as exciting as that. So my main other thing that I do outside of
you collect spores and molds,
studying infectious diseases is I'm a drummer in a bagpipe band.
Nice,
right?
Dude.
So I march around in kilts for fun. Went to Scotland last year with a group of people. I teach my own students on the weekends. It's a lot of fun. It's a good way to keep sane. I also played baseball, so my family and I always joke that like the way that I like took my frustrations out was just keep hitting shit, like hit a drum, hit a baseball, right?
Baseball, pot. You just went all in, man. Just like a champ.
I only hit things I was supposed to hit, though. Anyway, so a few months ago we had a practice, and we were driving out to practice, and I was carpooling with some friends, and one of my friends who's the leader, the drum corps leader, the lead drummer of our organization, just had a kid. And he's been trying to deal with like the kids now. Like he's like 7 months old right now, so he's just a little germ sack, right? So he's just off getting sick. His wife is just off getting sick. It's like they had just gotten over a really nasty kind of cold or flu or something really nasty. In fact, I think he got a version of flu B that was not vaccine. Like the vaccine did not work for that. So like, yeah, by the way, get your vaccine. I'm going to say that a million times, but there are some times when there's the flu mutates in a way that whatever. Anyway, so his family just gotten over that. I was feeling a little bit under the weather, but not bad enough to like, stop going to practice. I was, I wanted to go, right? It's my way to have students to teach, and it's my way of relaxing after a long week and everything. It's a Sunday afternoon. Why not? And I go, and I'm carpooling with these guys, and I sneeze a couple times, and then sure enough, they all get sick again, and they all hate me. It's like, come on, man, we just got out for 2 weeks of this shit, and now here we are again. So I felt really
you were
bad
patient zero. Dan was patient.
So
zero,
I was patient zero, or maybe patient one, and I got it from something. But anyway, I reaffirmed that you need to cover your mouth when you cough and sneeze, wash your hands, use hand sanitizer. All those little things are really going to help people not get sick, and if you are sick, to stop them from spreading people's diseases. The little simple stuff is the best way to prevent the spread of infections. So that's my kind of main.
And if you have like blood coming out of your orifices, chance go to the doctor. Like that's not
I would say don't go to the doctor. I would say stay home and
stay home and call the CDC.
Right.
Well, I'm glad we could end things on a positive note, and I think like honestly, and this is why I love when you actually talk with people that. Even if like we're not 100% experts on this particular, you still know 90% more than any of us, and you got to ask questions. And I think the media has a purpose of just getting ratings, right? Let's be honest. And so they're going to do whatever to scare the shit out of people. And I think for like podcasting, this is why I love this medium, because if you're doing it, I mean, it's a hobby, you're passionate about it. Maybe 1% of us will actually make any money on it, but we're doing it because we want to get some message out. We have an angle to it. And this is why I think this is why we do this, is because it's not about sensationalism. Let's actually get down to the bottom of it. And it may not be you're fucked like the Alex Jones, like, go out and buy my supplements. But it is about, listen, we got to pay attention to these things. If anything, really, I think that the message is like this: educate and understand like prevention, spread, understanding really what's going on. Even like I love the climate change aspect. That like these are the things we should be talking about and having conversations about. And it's amazing when you use that lump 3 feet above your ass, that brain. It's amazing how much you don't even need to be an expert on something, and it just makes sense. We can explain, you've been to school probably like 6 years probably, and we were able to find a way of explaining virology and epidemiology with a house party. And it's amazing how the answers are out there.
It's a two-way street, man. It's like I really appreciate you guys having the platform for us to be able to discuss it, but it's also from the world of science. It's our prerogative. It's our duty, I would say, for scientists who are literate in these fields. You don't have to be a world expert, but just to start engaging with people, start having these kinds of conversations. Because when you kind of get down into the gray matters of it all, again, another reference to the show, right? But as soon as you start sitting down, having a nice conversation that's not 280 characters in a tweet, just talking to people, that's where you really learn. That's where you really start spreading these passions and these ideas and these interests. So it's on us to do more science communication and dissemination of this knowledge. So I really appreciate you guys letting me come onto this platform, have another great time with you guys. I'm always happy to come back. If you guys want to do part 2 through 17 about infectious
we got
diseases,
to, man.
Sign me up, man. Sign me up.
I will geek out any day of the week on science, especially this is like my passion. Like it's like the not even guilty, the one that scares me, but I'm so fucking fascinated by it. So I got to geek out for an hour. So the way I look at it, I hope everyone else got something out of it. I got to geek out on
we
viruses.
A really cool cruise sickness story.
Yeah, I know. You got to find out. You can robo-trip and have a 104-degree fever at the same time. They didn't say it could be done,
Here
though.
we go.
I mean,
dropping those knowledge bombs. Great Matters Radio.
First it was 103 degrees. Now it's 104, and then next time he tells it'll be like 105.
It'll be 115 degrees. I shit you not. Between you and I, it was 112 degrees. All right. Oh, all right. Well, let's get out of here. We're not going to die. We're going to be okay.
Not
now, I
today.
imagine though, Dan will tell us though. He'll have like a little wink and nod. Maybe it'll be like a little like a code like on Twitter. It'd be like, Mike, watch out for the fallen Madonnas. That's when we know it's time to get bullets and seal the house up, right? But until we get our signal from Dan the Man, our our virologist, our bacteria researcher, whatever the fuck he is, he does in that little research unit that he does, he will get us covered, right? So on that note, everyone, I want to thank our guest, Dan Evans. Of course, my co-host, Bill, the Armchair Quarterback. You can catch him on the Armchair Quarterback on the 614 Radio Network.
All day.
All day. And I am Michael Devine, America's Counselor. And just remember, everyone, next time someone asks you, when are we going to die? I'm going to go, no, we're not going to fucking die. At least not of a virus, right? But they ask you if you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're red, you're blue. And just be like, well, fuck that noise. My ass is gray. All right, everyone, you be good to each other. Stay alive. Cover your mouth when you sneeze. Get your fucking flu shot, according to Dan. And I'll see you guys next week. You be good to each other. Peace.